Yeah, and also the idea that you're not going to get everything right, even when you are more experienced or you have more knowledge. You can be on a winning team and you do something and it doesn't work. You can be in a very developed or like mature part of your career, and you can try something and it doesn't work. It doesn't mean that you're bad or what you did is bad. It just means that it didn't work for whatever reason. I think people tend to move on like really really fast from failure or setbacks instead of sitting with it and kind of getting to grips with it and being comfortable with, okay, that went horribly, not as I expected. Let's do a debrief and work out like why something didn't go well, because a lot of what happens in the future is just, repeating something from your past that you didn't fully understand or fully unpack. And I think that debriefs, like in esports, are very important. And some people just want to go to the next. It's like solo queue, for example. You have a bad experience, and you want to click find game again really fast, but even though in your mind you're like, well, it was just my jungler who was griefing me. If you really unpack it a little bit more, you'll probably find out that there might have been situations in the game where you could have done more or differently that could have helped your griefing jungler, and then it maybe wouldn't have been as bad. And the same thing goes for coaches. I think that as a coach, especially like a head coach, for example, they tend to be a bit solitary. They tend to, not that they don't rely on other people, but it's almost seen as a sign of weakness to be over reliant, to be over democratic about decision making. So some coaches tend to be a little bit more lone wolf in that matter. So I think that unpacking that with people is really important, because you're not getting the full perspective. Because as a head coach, you have to say like, okay, this is a decision I'm making, and we're going with it. So there are variables you're taking into account that it's kind of like a horse with blinkers on running through a race. You're not like fully aware of like every perspective. I think actually the good coaches are the ones that can take in and ask people in a way where it's like, yeah, what do you think about this? Like, what would you do? Blah blah blah, and then you make them feel like they're part of it. Of course, if you're like an LFL coach and you're by yourself and you're doing everything, from media, marketing, stream, everything, it's kind of hard. But I think that there's a big kind of like responsibility kind of chasm for head coaches that it makes it hard to even sit, like I mentioned, with those kind of ideas of like, oh well, I failed, I messed up, because you can just say, "Oh, I have low resources," or this player is blah blah blah. But I think there's a lot that we can do even with our current situations, and I think that it's less about the decision and more about where you're taking into account all the variables. So pulling on the LFL part about being a head coach, like your experience is like you kind of have to learn to do everything, and like if were given like a 6-man coaching roster to work with, it changes how your workflow is in general. It can't just be kind of you versus the problem itself. It's okay, how can I include these guys into what I'm doing?
Mm. And the more and more people that you have working for you, the more your job becomes managing those people and getting the best out of those people, as opposed to
Yeah.
kind of doing your own thing. I mean, I think what you're saying there, I mean, it's exactly what I'm trying to do. I was trying to normalize getting support for coaches in esports, because we're so often incredibly short term. Everyone, I think rightly even, has the assumption that I have to be super confident in everything. Otherwise, people are not going to listen to me. And there's actually definitely a better balance to be found there. Just before we get too off on other things, because I'm having like 5 different questions as you're talking that come to mind. You talked about using debriefs to learn from failure. And that's one of the big things that I always kind of tell people. It's very easy to say, you win or you learn, or like
Mm.
it's easy to say that we should learn from
Lose is
failure.
improve.
Yeah, exactly. But it's harder to actually do it. So beyond actually taking some time and doing a debrief and looking back and thinking what didn't work and why, like there will be factors that maybe were outside of your control, but there's always going to be factors in your control as well.
Mm.
Do you have any other tips for people for how they can actually learn from failure rather than just fail and be like, well, it's okay because Rob said that I'm going to improve by failing?
Yeah, I think that it's kind of like the American like positivity mindset where you can be too positive about things, right? Like you can't be totalitarian in your positivity mindset, because it means that even when it comes, you're approached by a really horrendous situation, sometimes the human kind of response is to not be so positive. You kind of be like, oh damn, like I can't believe that my car got stolen. You can't be like, oh, it's fine, this is actually good for me. If you have that extreme positive mindset to everything, it's so far removed from the natural human response that you almost kind of like stand out in a bad way. So if I'm a player and my forwarder players are like, "Oh man, we lost the final," and then one guy's like, "No, this is good for us, guys. We're going to learn from this, and next year is ours." Like, it's like number one, too soon, and number two, it's like not a normal human response. But the same thing goes for coaches. If you always just go, "Oh, this is like failure is great," you're going to not like you're going to like search out failure or seek it out, but there is there is a strength in like the power of negative thinking where you try to come to a decision by thinking about all the things that can kind of like mess you up or you can trip over. Whereas positivity mindset doesn't allow you to think about those things. I only think about, I manifest this into existence. Like, and I think positively in it, do you have a more chance of it coming? Sure, you do. But in a competitive sport, for example, there are many things that you have to be prepared for. And if you don't take them into consideration, you have a higher chance of, of failure. So I do like to think about all the things that can go wrong before I think about like what I want to go right and how to actually guide it in that direction. But it's kind of like I'd much rather have a map of icebergs if I'm steering the Titanic rather than just like I hope I avoid icebergs because by the time you see them, it can be too late. So you have to be very preemptive about it. And I think that the biggest thing I would say is like, yeah, failure shouldn't be something that defines your career, but I think that if you have a support network, if you have a support system, those failures are a lot easier to, I guess, as hit as a speed bump and go over and continue going when you have someone to speak about it. But if you try to cover up every failure that you have, every mistake that you do, and oh, I'll just make some sort of external attribution towards it. So, oh, it was my player, it was the team, it was the draft, blah blah. You can always, 100% of the time, always come up with some external attribution for why something didn't go how you wanted it to go. And unfortunately, that just means that you're never really going to learn. So I would say there's going to be something you could have done better. It's like just figure out what that was. But then there's always going to be something that you kind of really didn't have control over. And I think understanding those two makes it a lot easier to understand that the decision that you made or whatever happened is kind of like an amalgamation of different things. It's not you or other people. It's not black or white. If you look at when someone misses a chance, Ronaldo's always got his hands on his hips, looking around, like blaming his teammates, kind of a thing. And when you look at Messi, it's kind of like different. And it's always been a very that's a generalization, of course, but you can always blame other people, and if you do, you're going to keep your confidence and keep your ego because it wasn't my fault. Like if I had full control, this wouldn't have happened. It's like, but you're never going to have full control. You're always going to be working under a GM. You're always going to have a strong voice in the team. You're always going to have like different things that can pull you away from full control, and you just have to control your part of it. So I think that's the big thing. Like find a support system, a support network, and number two, figure out what you could have changed and what was out of your control, and then you'll probably sleep a little bit better at night knowing that.
Mm. And having a plan coming in, I think, is so important because
Oh yeah,
once we have a goal or even just a rough plan or like a map of where we're trying to get to, it's so much easier to work out, where we slipped up, how we failed, and that kind of thing.